He married her in the name of God. He burned her in the name of truth. The house at 1128 Willow Ridge Lane was quiet that morning, eerily quiet, save for the rustling of police tape and the low hum of reporters setting up just beyond the crime scene. The bathtub had already been wheeled out, blackened and warped from fire. The neighbors whispered in disbelief, but no one dared speak too loud. Not here. Not in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Not about that kind of sin. To outsiders, Miles Lockwood was the last man you'd expect to see on national headlines. A decorated former Marine, a Sunday school volunteer, a forklift supervisor at the regional distribution center. Just a regular man with a Bible in his left hand and calluses on his right. The kind of man who still said ma'am and tipped the waitress even if the coffee was cold. But beneath that calm southern charm was a storm no one saw coming. They met at the food line. He was grabbing instant coffee. She was looking for vegan granola. She smiled first. He smiled back. That was how Miles and Delilah began, among cereal boxes and coupons. She was younger, radiant, with skin like melted honey and eyes that didn't belong in a town that small. There was a kind of mystery to her, like she'd come from a different world entirely. They started talking, then dating, then praying together. For months later, they were married in a Baptist chapel with stained glass windows and a choir that sang "Just as I Am" as she walked down the aisle in white lace. Everyone said they looked perfect together, and they did, except something about her always seemed just a little out of reach. Delilah never changed in front of him. She never swam in public. She insisted on keeping the bathroom door locked at all times, even when they were the only ones home. She said it was about modesty, privacy, trauma. And Miles, God bless his heart, respected it. He'd been taught that a man didn't pry into a woman's wounds, not if he truly loved her. And he did love her. But love, real, God-fearing, down-on-your-knees love, has its limits, especially when it feels like you're married to a stranger. They lived quietly in a one-story brick home with a cross on the mantle and scripture on the fridge. But behind that facade of peace, Miles began to feel unmoored. He'd reach for her in bed, and she'd flinch. She rarely kissed him, and when she did, it felt rehearsed, like she was trying to remind herself how. She always wore high-collared shirts, even in the heat, and when he'd brush against her stomach, she'd gently move his hand away. Still, he convinced himself it was love, that maybe she needed time, that maybe the Lord was testing him, that he was being taught patience. But patience, like grace, is not infinite. He would later testify that he loved her. He would say that he didn't mean to kill her, not exactly, that he simply wanted to know the truth, to wash away the lies, to make her clean again, holy again. If water couldn't cleanse her, he'd say, years later in court, his voice flat and hollow, then fire would. No one would have believed it if they hadn't seen the photos. The scorched porcelain, the blackened shower tiles, the melted bottle of lavender body wash. And in the center of it all, ashes of what used to be a woman named Delilah Lockwood. The honeymoon wasn't passionate, but Miles told himself that was okay. Not every love story had to start with fireworks. Delilah said she was nervous. She said she wanted to wait until things felt right. Miles, raised with scripture and restraint, respected that. He kissed her on the forehead that night and slept facing the wall. But weeks turned into months, and not tonight turned into maybe someday. At first, Miles prayed for patience. He read Corinthians over his morning eggs. He journaled verses about love being kind, long-suffering, not self-seeking. But inside, something small began to splinter. On their 6-month anniversary, he surprised her with candles, steak, and a bottle of the expensive red wine they couldn't afford. Delilah smiled, touched his hand across the table, and said, "This is lovely, babe. Thank you." She even put on lipstick. She wore his favorite blue dress. She leaned in close, almost close enough for more. But when he kissed her neck and reached for her waist, she froze, like a statue. He felt it then, not just her rejection, but her fear. And it was so palpable, so sudden, that he pulled away like he'd touched fire. She apologized, said she was tired. Migraines. I love you, I really do. Just not tonight. It wouldn't be tonight. It wouldn't be next week. Or next month. By their 1-year anniversary, they still hadn't consummated the marriage. Miles started having dreams. Strange ones. Dreams where Delilah was a stranger. Dreams where he walked into the bathroom and saw someone else in the mirror. Someone watching him. He brushed it off. Maybe it was stress. Maybe God was testing him again. But then the mail came. It was a package Delilah forgot to hide. Brown cardboard. No label. Just a pharmacy return address. Miles opened it, thinking it was something boring. Maybe supplements or skin cream. Inside, a box of estrogen pills, prescription refills, and a small silver razor wrapped in plastic. He stared at them, confused. Not angry, yet but confused. He placed the box back where it was and said nothing. That night, Delilah cooked him sweet potato chili. She was extra affectionate, almost glowing. Miles sat there across the table, watching her laugh, watching her tuck that perfect curl behind her ear. The way the candlelight hit her skin, she looked unreal, beautiful and distant, like a painting hung too high on a church wall. He wanted to ask her then, wanted to throw the pill box on the table and say, "What the hell is this?" But he didn't, because deep down, he was terrified of the answer. Things began to unravel from there, slowly but unmistakably. Delilah got defensive if he asked even the smallest question. She changed the subject whenever he brought up intimacy. She went to the bathroom with her phone and stayed there for 20, 30 minutes. Sometimes he'd hear water running, but no shower. He tried to dismiss the thoughts, but they wormed into his brain like rot behind drywall, growing, spreading. At work, he snapped at his coworkers. He stopped going to Bible study. At night, he sat on the edge of the bed watching Delilah sleep, wondering what she was dreaming about, wondering what she was hiding under that skin. One night, he did something he promised God he'd never do. He followed her. Delilah said she was going to a girls' night, but Miles didn't believe her. So he waited until she drove off, then took his truck and followed 2 blocks behind. No headlights. She didn't go to any friend's house. She parked at the Riverwalk, got out, walked to the water, and just stood there for nearly an hour, looking out into the Tennessee night. Her arms were folded, her head tilted upward, like she was praying, or remembering, or mourning something long gone. He never confronted her about it. But that image, Delilah by the water, alone and unreadable, burned into his mind. Then came the night of the storm. Rain battered the windows. Thunder rolled like distant drums. Miles couldn't sleep. He got up to get a glass of water, passed by the bathroom, and saw the light under the door. It was open, not wide, just a crack. But that crack would undo everything. He stepped closer instinctively. Something was off. The air smelled like lavender and anxiety. Then he saw it. Delilah, standing, back to him, peeing, the stream loud and clear, hitting porcelain in a way that no woman could produce. And he saw, just for a second, what she never wanted him to see. She wasn't sitting. She wasn't squatting. She was standing, like a man. Miles stumbled backward, heart racing like gunfire. He nearly knocked over the coat rack. He didn't say a word. He didn't confront her. He just went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed with his hand shaking. The clock ticked past 3 a.m. The rain poured harder. The truth had finally walked through the crack in the door, and it wasn't wearing a dress. The next morning, Miles didn't speak. He made coffee, poured 2 cups like he always did, but didn't touch his. The kitchen felt colder, though the thermostat read 72. Delilah sat at the counter, humming some gospel tune under her breath, flipping through the newspaper like everything was normal. But Miles saw it now, the things he didn't allow himself to see before. The curve of her jaw that seemed almost sculpted, the way she always adjusted her waistband, subtly like hiding something. The faint shadow on her neck she powdered every morning. He wasn't crazy. He hadn't imagined it. He'd seen it. Delilah turned to him with a soft smile. "Did you sleep okay, babe?" Miles nodded once. "Too tight." "Sure." His voice came out flat, foreign, like it didn't belong to him anymore. He called in sick to work, drove around aimlessly for hours. The roads blurred. Churches passed like ghosts in the rain. His mind buzzed, burning with questions he couldn't form into words. What was she? Who was she? And more importantly, who was he now? He had been a Marine, a man's man, the kind who stood for the anthem and taught boys how to split firewood. He believed in the truth, in hard work, in man and woman, husband and wife. That was how the world worked, how God made it. But now, the woman he kissed each morning, the one he held during thunderstorms, the woman he thought he'd build a family with, had stood over the toilet like a man. And the worst part? She didn't even flinch. He parked in front of New Mercy Baptist Church, the place where they'd said their vows. The steeple pointed toward a heaven he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He didn't go inside, just sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. That night, he didn't sleep. He watched Delilah from across the bed, her back turned, rising and falling with every breath. She looked peaceful, innocent, like nothing had changed. But everything had. The confrontation came 3 days later. Delilah had just finished folding laundry. She was putting a blouse back in her drawer when Miles said, without turning around, "I saw you." Delilah froze. The room went silent except for the whir of the ceiling fan. "I saw you in the bathroom," he continued, voice low. Standing, Delilah turned slowly, her face drained of color, like someone had pulled the truth right out of her bloodstream. She opened her mouth, closed it, then quietly, "I can explain." Miles chuckled, a bitter, broken sound. "Can you?" he snapped. "Explain what exactly?" "That you've been lying to me since day one? That you've been hiding a dick in my house like it's some dirty secret?" Delilah's eyes welled up. "I'm not lying to you, Miles. I couldn't find the right time." "There's no right time for this," he roared. "You think this is normal? You think I would have said I do if I knew what you were?" Delilah flinched at the word. "What you were? Not who." "I'm still me," she whispered. "I'm still Delilah." "No, you're not," he hissed. "Delilah doesn't exist. She's a costume, a trick." Miles stood now, towering over her, fists clenched at his sides. The room pulsed with heat. Delilah took a step back. "I wanted to tell you. I swear to God I did. But you love me. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I could be safe. Like I didn't have to defend myself just to breathe. I didn't tell you because I didn't trust you, Miles. I didn't tell you because I was finally starting to trust the world again." He stared at her like she was speaking another language. "So you let me marry you. Take vows before God. Let me put a ring on a lie." Delilah swallowed. "I didn't lie. I am a woman. I've always been one. I just wasn't born the way you expect." Miles shook his head, disgusted. "That's not how God made you." "No," she whispered, "but it's how I survived him." He didn't hit her. He didn't scream again. He just walked out, drove until the gas light blinked red, sat in a Kroger parking lot, and stared at a flickering lamppost for 2 hours. His phone buzzed with texts. He ignored them. He wasn't angry anymore. He was ashamed. Ashamed that he didn't see it. Ashamed that he still remembered the way her voice soothed him. Ashamed that part of him still wanted to believe her. But mostly, he was ashamed that deep down, some small, awful part of him still loved her. Back at home, Delilah sat on the floor of their bedroom, arms wrapped around her knees, shaking. She'd known this day might come. She'd always known. No matter how many pills, surgeries, or prayers, people like her didn't get happy endings. She had made peace with that long ago. But she hadn't expected Miles to be the one to end it. Not the man who said he'd love her through sickness and secrets. She wasn't always called Delilah. She used to be Deshawn Isaiah Parks, born on a humid summer morning in Birmingham, Alabama, in a body that never quite fit. Her earliest memories weren't of joy, but of hiding. Hiding the way her fingers moved. Hiding the softness in her voice. Hiding the way her eyes lit up when she saw her mother's dresses swaying on the clothesline. By age 6, her father had already told her to man up more times than she could count. By 10, the beatings had started. Not for bad grades, not for lying or stealing, but for walking with too much rhythm in her hips. For lingering too long near the women's section at Target. For crying. Her bedroom door was once kicked off its hinges because she dared to put on lip gloss. Her brother called her Sissy, like it was her middle name. And her mother, God bless her, stood silently in the kitchen, stirring beans, pretending she didn't hear the yelling. When she was 16, she came out, not with a flag, not with fanfare, just a whisper to her pastor during a youth retreat. She said she thought she might be different. He didn't answer her. He just laid his hand on her forehead and prayed for the demons to leave. That night, her father threw her out of the house. No warning. No suitcase. Just a trash bag full of shirts too big and sneakers too tight. She slept on a church bench the first night. On the floor of a Greyhound station the second. By the third night, she found herself in Atlanta, drawn to the glitter of a city where no one knew her name. A city where she could start over. She worked at diners, cleaned motel rooms, sold plasma, ate dollar menu burgers, and stole hotel shampoos to survive. But every time she saw herself in a mirror, something looked wrong, off-center, like the frame didn't match the painting. It took her 3 years to save up for hormones. Another 5 to afford surgery. In between, she met sisters, trans women who taught her how to apply eyeliner, how to walk without fear, how to demand to be seen. They weren't perfect. Most had scars they didn't talk about. One had lost an eye. Another slept with a knife under her pillow. But they were family in ways her own blood never was. And through them, Delilah was born, not as an escape, but as a return. A return to the softness she'd always known was real. To the gospel music she still sang quietly when no one was listening. To the version of herself that didn't flinch in the mirror anymore. She picked the name Delilah because it was the only Bible woman her father ever called dangerous. A woman who held power in her hands, even if men feared it. Delilah Imani Parks. Then Delilah Lockwood. She signed it for the first time at the pharmacy counter, shaking with joy and fear, tears blurring the ink. She never expected a fairy tale. Never expected a white dress or pews full of flowers. But when Miles walked up to her at that Food Lion, smiling like she mattered, something in her broke open. He made her laugh, made her feel like the softest parts of her were worth holding. She tried to tell him. But each time, her courage faltered. Each time she thought, maybe tomorrow. Maybe once he's ready. Maybe once he sees the woman, not the history. But tomorrow never came. And now, tomorrow was ash and silence and fire. That night, Miles didn't come home. Delilah sat awake in the dark, lights off, windows shut. A bottle of wine half empty. A gospel song playing softly from her phone, repeating the words. Come as you are, the broken and the bruised. And across town, Miles kneeled at the back pew of a church. His fists were clenched. His eyes were dry. And he prayed for a solution. A cleansing. A fire. The church pew was hard against his spine. The wooden cross at the altar stared down like a judgment. Miles hadn't been inside First Baptist of Chattanooga since the wedding. Since the day he slipped a ring onto Delilah's trembling finger and promised God he'd love her forever. That promise now felt like a noose tightening around his throat. He sat in the back corner, hunched, unnoticed, hands clasped tight enough to crack his knuckles. He didn't cry. He couldn't. Tears required certainty, and right now, Miles wasn't sure of anything, except that he was being tested. The devil disguises himself as an angel of light. The verse echoed in his head on repeat. His father used to say that when they passed by anything he didn't understand, gay pride marches on TV, effeminate men at the gas station, even a boy in high school who wore nail polish, his father would spit the verse like venom. And now it came back to Miles, wrapping around his brain like barbed wire. Had the devil crept into his house? Had he slept beside it? He closed his eyes, tried to picture Delilah as she had been, soft, warm, humming gospel tunes as she cooked, holding his hand in church. But now, every image was corrupted. He saw her standing in that bathroom, body backlit, quiet, unashamed, masculine, deceptive. He clutched the edges of the Bible in the pew in front of him and whispered, "God, tell me what to do." The next morning, he called Pastor Vernon Hall. Pastor Vernon had known Miles since he was 16. He'd baptized him in a cold river, taught him how to listen for God in silence. The man had a voice like syrup and a presence that made you want to confess things. They met in the pastor's office behind the chapel. Wood-paneled walls, an old photo of Billy Graham, and a taxidermy deer head that always looked like it was judging you. Miles sat down heavily, his face hollow. "I think I married a man," he said. Pastor Vernon blinked once. "Tell me everything." Miles told him about the locked doors, the lack of sex, the pills, and finally the bathroom, the standing, the truth. Pastor Vernon listened without interruption. His fingers steepled, lips tight. When Miles finished, the pastor leaned back and exhaled through his nose. "That's a lot, son." Miles nodded slowly. "I feel like I've been living in sin and didn't even know it." Pastor Vernon tilted his head. "You weren't living in sin, Miles. You were lied to. You were deceived, and that is the devil's game. He doesn't knock on the door. He seeps in through the cracks." Miles swallowed hard. "What do I do?" Pastor Vernon stood, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out a worn leather-bound book, Deliverance Through Fire, Cleansing the Soul of Sexual Sin. He placed it gently on the table in front of Miles. "There is only one thing that ever purified a sacrifice in the Old Testament," he said. Miles stared down at the cover. His fingers trembled as he touched it. That night, he didn't go home. He slept in his truck behind a Waffle House and dreamt of fire. He dreamt of Delilah calling his name, surrounded by smoke, eyes wide with betrayal. When he woke up, he couldn't stop shaking. Over the next few days, something in Miles hardened. He stopped questioning, stopped praying for answers. He'd been given one. He began making lists, quietly, obsessively, things he would need, where he would buy them, what time Delilah usually bathed, how long it would take to fill the tub, how long it would take her to realize what was happening. He bought 2 gallons of gasoline from a remote station 40 minutes outside town. Paid cash. He ordered lavender candles and a brass crucifix online. He began calling the act in his head the cleansing. It made him feel calm, controlled. Like this wasn't murder, it was obedience, correction, justice. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a husband anymore. He saw a purifier. One night, Delilah left for a therapy appointment. Miles entered the bathroom and began preparing. He cleaned the tub, set candles in each corner, taped a verse to the mirror. "And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." Malachi 3 verse 3. Then he practiced pouring. He timed the spread of the gasoline, how fast it soaked the bath mat, how it curled the shower curtain like a dying petal. He rehearsed how he would speak to her, calm, like a preacher giving a benediction. This wasn't about rage. It was about truth. The next day, he wrote a letter to Pastor Vernon. Just a few lines. It's done. She's going to see him now. Please pray for her soul. Then he wrote a second letter to himself to be found later. If water could not wash away her lie, then I must turn to fire. Let this be counted not as wrath, but as righteousness. He signed it with a simple M. The final item he needed was wine, the bottle they'd saved since their wedding. They hadn't opened it. For something special, Delilah had said. Miles now uncorked it like a priest preparing communion. He placed 2 glasses beside the tub. Then he waited for her to come home. The front door opened with a soft click. Delilah stepped in, rain on her shoulders, keys jangling in her hand. She was humming. Something gentle old, maybe Mahalia Jackson or Aretha's gospel years. She looked tired but peaceful. The house smelled sweet. Too sweet. Lavender. She frowned. Miles. No answer. The lights were dim. Candles glowed down the hallway, flickering gently like something sacred. Delilah's brow creased. She walked toward the bathroom, heels echoing on the hardwood floor. Miles? What is this? The bathroom door was open. Inside, a full bathtub, steam rising, candles in each corner, a brass crucifix hanging above the mirror, 2 glasses of red wine sitting on the sink, and Miles sitting on a stool dressed in his wedding suit. The same gray suit he wore the day he said, "I do." He looked up at her like she was a guest of honor at a funeral. "Close the door, Delilah," he said softly. "It's time." At first, she laughed, nervous, uncertain. "What is this? An anniversary?" "A what?" Miles stood, lifted one of the glasses. "A ritual," he said. "A baptism." Delilah's smile faltered. His voice was calm. Too calm. "I've forgiven you," he continued. "I want you to know that. I've spoken to the Lord. He understands now. And soon, you will too." Delilah's stomach dropped. She stepped back, glancing down at the tub. The water shimmered, but something about it smelled wrong. Not soap, not bath oil, gasoline. She froze. "Miles," she said, voice low. "What did you do?" He raised the crucifix in one hand and the wine in the other. "I anoint you," he whispered, "in the name of truth, in the name of fire, in the name of what you should have been." Delilah's voice cracked. "This is insane." "No," Miles said, stepping closer. "This is holy." She turned to run, but he was faster. He grabbed her by the wrist and spun her back toward the tub. Her hips slammed into the porcelain edge. She screamed, kicked, clawed, but Miles was strong, trained, and his grip had the fury of conviction. He shoved her into the water. She splashed down hard, her legs thrashing. "Miles," she screamed. "Please." He lit a match. Just one. And for a moment, just a moment, he looked at her, eyes full of something that was almost love, or what was left of it. "I forgive you," he said. Then he dropped the match. The fire didn't explode like in the movies. It spread, creeping, then leaping, then roaring. Delilah's scream shattered through the house. Skin against flames. Steam and gas fusing into toxic smoke. The tub ignited like a crucible. Her hands reached up, grasping at nothing, fingernails scraping the edges. Mild, but he didn't move. He stood still, eyes unblinking, watching her burn as if she were being lifted into heaven. And for a moment, just a second, he smiled. The flames danced across her skin. Her curls blackened. Her voice turned from screaming to choking. Then silence. Just the sound of fire, hungry and holy. The smoke alarms blared. Neighbors would say later they smelled something strange, something they couldn't place. Plastic, lavender, death. Miles walked out the front door slowly, the hem of his suit singed. He sat on the front steps, pulled out the second wine glass, and drank it. When the police arrived, he was still there. Calm, hands on his knees, soot on his face like war paint. One officer shouted, "Sir, what happened?" Miles looked up at him and simply said, "She's clean now." Inside, the fire had already consumed most of the bathroom. What remained of Delilah was unrecognizable, just blackened bone and melted flesh in the shape of a woman who never had the chance to be one, in the eyes of those who refused to see her. The tub cracked, the mirror shattered, and behind it, still taped to the wall, remained the verse, "And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." When the firefighters kicked down the bathroom door, the flames had mostly died, leaving only steam, ash, and the stench of burnt flesh. One rookie officer vomited. Another whispered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath, stepping back like he'd just walked into hell. The scene was more than a crime. It was a message. They found her body fused to the porcelain, hands contorted in a final, desperate reach toward the ceiling. Her engagement ring had melted into her finger. Her jaw was locked open in a silent scream. The tub had cracked. The mirror had burst. And taped behind it, untouched by fire, was the single Bible verse. "And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." Malachi 3 verse 3. It wasn't just murder. It was ritual. Miles was arrested without resistance. He didn't try to run. He didn't argue. As they cuffed him on the front steps, he looked up at the sunrise and said softly, "She's with God now." And God sees the truth. Inside the house, investigators uncovered a carefully curated madness. A notepad of handwritten verses circled and underlined in red ink. A timeline with dates, candle types, and bathwater temperatures. Receipts for gasoline, ordered candles, a crucifix, and matches. And beneath his sock drawer, 2 sealed envelopes. One addressed to Pastor Vernon Hall. The other addressed simply, "To whom it may concern." The letter to Pastor Vernon was short. "I did what you couldn't. I burned the lie. Pray for her soul, as I have." The pastor turned it over to authorities immediately and publicly condemned the act, stating, "I never preached hate. I never told him to act. I only pointed him to Scripture. This was a lost man's interpretation, not God's will." But it was too late. The media exploded. By the next morning, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Justice for Delilah. Hashtag Trans Lives Matter. Hashtag Burned for Being. Hashtag Religious Terrorism. Hashtag He married her then burned her. Fox News called it a tragic consequence of deception in modern relationships. MSNBC called it a hate crime fueled by fundamentalist delusion. Twitter called it everything all at once. Delilah's identity was revealed within hours. Her birth name, Deshawn Isaiah Parks. Her transition history, hormone therapy records, and medical files were leaked. Some called her a liar. Others called her a martyr. Old friends from her hometown in Birmingham shared stories about her kindness, her fear, her fight to live authentically. One friend posted a selfie of them in high school, both in choir robes, smiling. She just wanted to be loved, and he burned her alive. Outside the courthouse, protests swelled. 2 groups stood on opposite sides of the police barricades, one waving rainbow flags and chanting, "Delilah had a name. Delilah had a right." The other holding signs reading, "God created Adam and Eve," and "Deception is death." Tension turned violent more than once. Pepper spray was deployed. One man was hospitalized after being hit with a Bible. Meanwhile, Miles remained silent in his cell. He didn't speak to the press, didn't call his mother, didn't ask for a lawyer. He spent most of his time reading the same worn Bible that had sat on his wedding nightstand. In the margins, he had scribbled phrases like, "Truth burns lies. God did not make her. Forgiveness is fire." When detectives asked him why he did it, he said only because no one else would. The local sheriff, Marisol Graves, called it one of the most disturbing cases in Chattanooga's history. At the press conference, she fought back tears as she described the scene. "We're not just talking about a murder," she said. "We're talking about a belief system so twisted it turned a husband into an executioner." Then came the funeral. Delilah's family held 2 services, one in Birmingham, under her birth name, for relatives who still struggled to accept her transition, one in Atlanta, organized by LGBTQ plus activists and friends, under the name Delilah Imani Lockwood. At the second service, her best friend, Tasha Whitman, spoke from the pulpit. She didn't die because she was deceptive. She died because the world couldn't accept her truth, and because one man thought God gave him permission to play judge, jury, and executioner. A choir sang, "His eye is on the sparrow." Candles were lit, and in the back pew, a small boy, no older than 10, wore a shirt that read, "I'm not a sin." The trial of Miles Lockwood began on a gray Thursday morning in early March. Outside the courthouse, 2 rivers of protest clashed at the police barricades, one waving rainbow flags and signs that read "Trans Lives Matter" and "Justice for Delilah," the other holding Bibles, wooden crosses, and posters that screamed "Man and woman only" and "Truth is not hate." National reporters lined the sidewalks. News vans spilled cords across the pavement like veins. Inside, 100 eyes turned toward a man in a beige prison uniform, sitting motionless at the defense table. Miles looked thinner, paler. His once proud posture had given way to a stiff, cold rigidity. He blinked slowly, like nothing around him mattered anymore. Maybe it didn't. When the prosecution opened, the courtroom went still. Assistant District Attorney Lander Beck stood, heels sharp against the tile floor, and lifted the photograph, one that jurors would never forget. The scorched bathtub, a melted wedding ring still fused a bone. The room blackened, silent, hollow. She said Delilah Lockwood was a woman. She lived as a woman. She loved as a woman. And she died, burned alive by the man she loved, because she dared to believe that was enough. There was no need to sensationalize the crime. The facts were brutal on their own. A bathtub filled with gasoline. A crucifix above the mirror. Candles in each corner. A handwritten Bible verse taped just above the flames. "And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver." This wasn't rage, Beck said. It was theology twisted into execution. The defense didn't deny what happened. Instead, they sought to reframe the why. Attorney Michael Darren stood and told the jury that Miles Lockwood was a man of faith, a man of principle, a man who believed, perhaps wrongly, that he had been deceived into a marriage he would have never entered if he had known the truth. Darren spoke calmly, deliberately, choosing his words like weapons dressed in velvet. Miles believed he was straight, he said. He believed he was married to a woman. But what if, suddenly, violently, he realized the foundation of his identity had been built on a lie? He argued diminished capacity, emotional shock, religious trauma. Miles had suffered a psychological break, not out of hate, but out of existential crisis. This wasn't a hate crime, Darren said. It was the collapse of a man who could no longer reconcile his faith with his reality. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses. The crime scene investigator who described the layout of the bathroom like it was an altar. The medical examiner who testified that Delilah had lived for at least 40 seconds after ignition, long enough to feel everything. They called Delilah's therapist, who fought through tears to recall the session where Delilah whispered, "If he ever finds out, I don't think I'll survive it." But the most devastating testimony came from her best friend, Tasha Whitman, who told the court Delilah had loved Miles deeply, desperately, and had spent nights crying in fear, wanted to tell him the truth, but never finding the courage. She wasn't hiding, Tasha said, voice cracking. She was protecting herself. The defense leaned heavily on religious context. They brought in Pastor Vernon Hall, who admitted that he had counseled Miles using Old Testament scripture, but insisted he never encouraged violence. They presented a psychologist who diagnosed Miles with religious delusional disorder, explaining how years of rigid doctrine, combined with perceived betrayal, created a mental state ripe for spiritual psychosis. Through it all, Miles sat blank-faced. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He watched the images of his wife's burnt body with the same calm he wore the night they arrested him. When asked by the court if he wanted to testify, he shook his head once. No. Delilah's gender became the courtroom's quiet cancer. Whispers, glances. The word deception passed between lips like poison. Some jurors couldn't hide their discomfort. Others clenched their jaws with fury. The question lingered in the walls. Did Delilah have a duty to disclose who she was? And if she didn't, did that justify her death? Closing arguments sealed the courtroom silence. Leandra Beck stood with one final photo, Delilah in her wedding dress, smiling, unaware of the fire her love would cost her. This was not a moment of confusion, Beck said. This was a man who set his house up like a church, placed his wife in the center, and lit a match in the name of God. He didn't just murder her. He tried to erase her. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty. First-degree murder. Guilty. Hate crime enhancement. Guilty. Criminal use of fire to commit a felony. The judge read the sentence without pause. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 25 additional years. Still, Miles showed no emotion, no regret. As they led him away in chains, he looked up at the wooden cross on the wall behind the judge's bench. And he smiled, as if he still believed he had done God's work, as if burning the truth into Delilah's skin had somehow set him free. But outside those courtroom walls, the world was no longer his to define. The trial ended, but the nation didn't move on. For weeks after the verdict, candlelight vigils were held in over 40 cities. LGBTQ+ centers saw a surge in security threats. Churches received letters both condemning and applauding the verdict. Commentators couldn't stop asking, was this a hate crime, a moral collapse, or simply the symptom of a country that still hadn't decided what truth really meant? Delilah's name trended again, not just as a victim, but as a symbol. Murals were painted in New York, Atlanta, Oakland. One showed her in a bathtub full of fire, her hands reaching up, her eyes open and defiant. Another showed her in a wedding dress made of rose petals and flames, standing tall against a sky that read, "I am not a lie." The phrase became a rallying cry. "I'm not a lie," printed on shirts, tattooed on arms, chanted at marches. At the Tennessee Capitol, a bill was introduced, Delilah's Law, prohibiting the use of panic defenses based on gender identity or sexual orientation. It passed by a razor-thin margin after a fiery debate where one lawmaker held up a burned wedding ring and said, "If this doesn't wake us up, nothing will." Colleges added her name to queer history curricula. Netflix announced a docuseries. Hulu announced a dramatized miniseries. Podcasts debated her choices. Pundits dissected Miles' mental health. Church leaders issued statements. And through it all, the country kept asking itself the same question. Did she deserve to die because she didn't say everything? Tasha Whitman, Delilah's best friend, kept her promise. She opened a shelter in Atlanta called Delilah's House. It became a home for trans women facing violence, rejection, or just the quiet fear of not being believed. On the front wall hung a large portrait of Delilah, taken 1 week before the wedding. Her face tilted upward, eyes bright, hand pressed against her chest. Beneath it was etched. She just wanted to be loved like anyone else. Weeks after the verdict, Delilah's best friend, Tasha Whitman, appeared on a national primetime interview. The host introduced her as the woman who knew Delilah better than anyone, and Tasha sat on the plush studio couch, back straight, hands clasped tight in her lap, eyes already brimming before the first question even came. She wore Delilah's favorite earrings, gold hoops with tiny pearls, and a black blazer that swallowed her shoulders. Her voice trembled at first, but as the lights dimmed and the studio hushed, she began to speak. I met Delilah when we were both 19. She just moved to Atlanta. We were working at the same diner, pulling doubles, trading stories over stale coffee and fry grease. She was funny, quiet but fierce, the kind of girl who didn't speak much unless it mattered. And when she did, you listened. The interviewer asked when Tasha first learned the truth about Delilah's identity. She told me on the third night we hung out. No hesitation, no drama. Just said, I used to go by Deshawn, but I don't anymore. If that's a problem, I'll leave now. And I just laughed. I said, girl, pass me that eyeliner and stop being dramatic. That's how we were. She never pretended with me. Never had to. Tasha paused, breathing through her nose. Delilah was always honest with the people she felt safe with. But safety? That's rare, especially for someone like her. The world taught her early that honesty could get her killed. So yeah, sometimes she held back. But not to deceive, to protect herself. The screen behind them showed a photo, Delilah in a yellow sundress, hair curled, laughing so hard her eyes had disappeared. She told me about Miles 6 months before the wedding. Tasha continued. Said he was gentle. Said he prayed before meals. Said he made her feel like she could breathe again. She was scared, but she also believed. She wanted the dream. She turned to the host, her voice hardening. You know what kills me the most? It's that she wasn't hiding. She was waiting for a moment where love and truth could exist in the same room without fear. The host asked if Tasha had ever warned her. I did, Tasha said quietly. The night before the wedding, we were sitting on our porch drinking boxed wine, and I said, "Are you sure he's ready?" And she looked at me, dead serious, and said, "No, but I'm tired of waiting for someone who is." Tasha wiped at her eyes, then looked directly into the camera. She wasn't trying to trap anyone. She wasn't pretending. She was trying to live, and she was punished for it. Not by God, not by fate, but by a man who couldn't handle the truth of the woman he said he loved. There was silence in the studio. Heavy, absolute. Then the host leaned forward and asked, "If you could say one thing to her now, what would it be?" Tasha's face crumpled, but she didn't look away from the lens. "I'd say, you were enough, just as you were. You were always enough." The interview went viral overnight. Millions watched. Thousands shared. But in the quiet corners of the internet, in comment sections and forums and trans support pages, people didn't just watch. They wept. Because someone had finally said it out loud. Because somewhere, another Delilah was listening. As for Miles Lockwood, he remains in solitary confinement at Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. He does not speak. He does not write. When reporters requested interviews, he refused them all. He spends his days reading scripture or staring at the wall. According to guards, he's never shown remorse. One inmate who passed him during library call said Miles muttered a single line over and over. Truth burns lies. Inside Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, Miles Lockwood became a myth before he became a man again. At first, the other inmates kept their distance. Not out of fear, but confusion. He wasn't loud. He didn't posture like the lifers and be block. He didn't join the white gangs or take the Bible study classes offered in the chapel. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, only in clipped sentences that always circled back to Scripture. He became known simply as Preacher Burn. Twice a week, he requested time in the chapel alone. He'd sit there on the wooden bench, staring at the crucifix like it owed him something. He read only one book, the same scorched-edge Bible he'd been arrested with, now rebound with prison tape. Pages torn, margins filled with scribbled phrases. Flesh deceives. Baptism by fire. God does not make mistakes, but man does. A guard named Alvarez once saw him kneeling in the middle of his cell at 2 a.m., whispering to the floor. When asked who he was speaking to, Miles answered, without looking up, her ashes. He was denied contact with any outside clergy after prison psychiatrists flagged his behavior as religious fixation bordering on psychosis. He refused therapy. He refused letters from his mother. When his sister sent him a photo of her newborn daughter, he burned it with a prison-issued match and flushed the ashes. In the yard, he walked in circles, always the same path, always in silence. One inmate, a former seminary student turned bank robber, tried to speak to him once, just to ask, "What did you see in her that terrified you so much?" Miles didn't answer, but that night, he carved a single phrase into the underside of his metal cot using a toothbrush shard. She wore light like armor. The phrase disturbed the warden so much, the cot was replaced the next morning. He kept a calendar on the wall of his cell made of soap scratches. Not to mark the days until parole, he had none, but to count the days since her death. On the anniversary, he refused food, spoke to no one, and smeared ashes from a burnt Bible page across his forehead. A week later, during cell inspection, a guard found something hidden behind a loose brick, a child's drawing of a wedding chapel, rendered in pencil and blood. The prison therapist noted in his report, subject exhibits delusions of spiritual martyrdom, mixed with unresolved identity trauma and signs of developing self-erasure. He no longer perceives his crime as an act of murder, but as a sacrament. Still, Miles never confessed regret, only purpose. Once, a new correctional officer tried to provoke him, mocked Delilah, spit her name like poison, expecting a reaction. Miles stood slowly, stepped forward until his breath touched the guard's collar, and in a voice cold enough to freeze blood, whispered, "Be careful with fire, son. You don't know who's watching." The officer requested transfer that same week. A year to the day after her death, a memorial was held outside the courthouse. It was raining the same way it had the night Delilah died. People gathered with umbrellas and signs. Some came in silence. Others sang. A choir of black, trans women lifted their voices in a hymn Delilah used to hum. His eyes on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Among the crowd gathered outside the courthouse, wrapped in coats and holding flickering candles beneath umbrellas, stood a woman named Noelle Brooks. She was tall, 47, black. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of battles long fought and barely survived. A hush fell as she stepped to the mic, cleared her throat once before leaning in. "My name is Noelle. I'm a trans woman, and I almost didn't make it to tonight." She paused. The rain tapped gently against her coat. "In 1999, I was living in rural Mississippi, working 2 jobs, keeping my head down. I was dating a man I met at a car wash. He was handsome, Christian, called me queen even before I could say my own name with pride." Her voice broke slightly, but she held steady. "One night I told him. I sat him down, made tea, lit a candle. I told him I was born different, that I had to fight every inch of my life to become the woman I am." He didn't say a word, just stared. She looked into the crowd. Then he beat me unconscious, left me bleeding in the bathtub, said he was cleansing the house of confusion. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital. They told me I was lucky. She held up one trembling hand. I didn't feel lucky. A few people in the crowd began to cry. Some bowed their heads. Some squeezed each other's hands tighter. Noelle's voice softened. For years, I stopped telling people who I was. I stopped loving. I stopped hoping. I lived like I was borrowing the body of a dead woman, just waiting to be caught. She gestured to the mural of Delilah behind her. But then I saw her. I saw Delilah's story, and something in me cracked open again. I remembered that we don't just survive in silence. We survive by being seen. She looked directly at the front row, where Tasha Whitman stood, clutching a photo of Delilah to her chest. She burned, but her flame lit mine, and mine has lit others. And tonight, I'm standing here to say, you did not erase her. You made her eternal. The crowd erupted in applause, not explosive but reverent, like church, like a promise. And in the back of the crowd, a young girl no older than 12 stepped forward. Her hair was braided, her dress too big. She took the mic, voice trembling. My name is Serenity. I'm trans, and I'm not afraid anymore. The crowd erupted in tears. Someone whispered, Delilah would have loved her. Some say justice was served. Others say it came too late. But one truth remains. She burned, not because she was dangerous, but because someone else thought her existence was. And still, through fire, fear, and silence, Delilah's story lit something far bigger than a bathroom or a bathtub. It lit a conversation. It lit a reckoning. And in that light, for the first time, people finally saw her.